This episode contains particularly distressing incidents and violence against minors. It may not be suitable for all listeners. Considering herself a bit of a psychic, Judy Barnes sensed something was wrong. Her teenage son, Alan, had failed to return home on Sunday, June 17, 1979, following a night out with friends. If he were running late or was otherwise caught up, Alan would always contact his mother to let her know. This time, Judy had not heard a thing. Her mind was plagued with visions of Alan, his shoulder-length blonde hair, deep brown eyes, and handsome face, all covered in blood. The weekends of mid-1979 followed the same routine for friends Alan Barnes and Darko Castellan. Nearly every Saturday, Alan would stay the night at Darko's house, as his family lived closer to the Adelaide CBD than he did. Just about to turn 17, Alan spent his weekends partying with Darko and enjoying the Adelaide nightlife. On Sunday afternoons, Alan would head back to his family's house in the suburb of Salisbury. The weekend commencing June 16th was no different. Alan spent Saturday night with Darko, and the next morning, the pair headed into the city. By the afternoon, Alan was plotting his journey home. Darko planned to join Alan at his place, but Salisbury was 25 kilometers northeast of the CBD, so the pair would need a ride. They stood outside the Pennington Hotel on Grand Junction Road, a major thoroughfare in the northern part of the city, and began hitchhiking. Cars passed, but no one stopped to pick up the young men. Darko suggested that Alan go home alone, thinking he might have better luck flagging down a car as a single passenger. Alan agreed, and the two said their goodbyes before going their separate ways. Fahim Hodzic knew Alan Barnes and was in the area at the time the 16-year-old was hitchhiking home. As Fahim drove along Grand Junction Road, he saw who he thought was Alan running up to a stationary white Holden HQ sedan. One of its passenger doors opened as Alan approached. Fahim could make out another 3 or 4 passengers in the Holden. As he drove away, Fahim glanced up at his rearview mirror. Alan was gone. As that Sunday came to an end with no sign of her son, Judy Barnes phoned the police to report him missing. 4 days later, on June 21st, Alan turned 17. It was a bleak day with no reason to celebrate. He was still missing. Around an hour's drive northeast of Adelaide is the South Para Reservoir, the second largest reservoir in South Australia. The artificial lake is surrounded by an expansive bushland reserve, popular with outdoor enthusiasts. On the morning of Sunday, June 24, 1979, 2 bushwalkers set out on one of the many trails lining the reserve. They neared the South Para Bridge, which spanned a section of the reservoir. The water underneath was extremely low at the time, exposing the lake's muddy base. Down there, lying in the brown muck, was the body of a young man. It was obvious to police that the victim had either jumped, been pushed, or dumped from the top of the bridge. His back was broken and twisted from the impact. As such, the major crime squad were called in to assist in a possible homicide. A search of the surrounding area failed to yield any clues. Shortly after the discovery, Judy Barnes opened her front door to find a police officer on her doorstep. The young man found dead at the South Para Reservoir was her son, Alan. The reservoir was 50 kilometers from where Alan was last seen hitching a ride from a Holden HQ sedan. Grand Junction Road moved west to east, providing a direct route via connecting roads to the reservoir. Alan had suffered tremendous physical injury prior to his death. After enduring a severe beating, a tapered blunt object such as a bottle had been forced into his rectum, tearing major blood vessels in the area. Rapid blood loss and shock set in, killing Alan within 30 minutes. Despite this, there was no trace of blood on Alan's skin, as his body had been washed prior to being dumped. He was also wearing different clothes to what he had last been seen in. His family confirmed that the clothes were not his, and they had never seen them before. Time of death was calculated to have been within 48 hours of the discovery of Alan's body, meaning he was alive for the duration of the week he was missing. Trichloroethanol was found in his system, a byproduct of the sedative hypnotic drug chloral hydrate, used to treat insomnia. Furthermore, his blood alcohol content was 0.19%. It was likely Allen was given a Mickey Finn, an alcoholic drink laced with a psychoactive drug. In this case, chloral hydrate. The combination would have weakened the teenager, limiting his ability to fight off his attacker. Whoever had dumped Allen's body intended it to land in the water under the South Para Bridge and sink into the mud. However, the low water level ensured Allen's body remained visible to passers-by. A reward for information was offered to identify Allen's killer, but failed to generate any leads. Tuesday, August 28, 1979, was a warm and pleasant day. Two men set out in a dinghy in Mutton Cove, 20 kilometers northwest of Adelaide City. The cove is situated near where the Port Adelaide River empties out into the sea. The conditions were calm when the men took to the water, perfect for a spot of casual fishing. As they passed a disused wharf near the Osborne Gas Works, something in the water caught their eye. It was a partially submerged garbage bag, snagged on some rocks and bobbing with the tide. They boated closer to get a better look. When they approached, one of the men could make out the heel of a human foot sticking out of the bag. When pathologist Dr. Ross James emptied the bag onto a concrete slab to commence an autopsy, he was struck by the horror it contained. He had never come across a case like it. Inside was the body of a young male adult. His abdominal and chest cavity had been emptied of all internal organs, which were nowhere to be found. His arms had been cut off at the sockets and legs at the pelvis, then stripped of skin and muscle. The limbs had then been placed into a plastic bag and inserted into the cavity in the chest. Skin-bearing identifying tattoos had not been discarded, but had instead been retained and placed in the torso as well. Also, inside the cavity was a small plastic bag containing severed fingers and dissected genital organs. One testicle was missing. Investigators theorized it might have been eaten by the killer or kept as a trophy. The victim also had injuries consistent with anal intercourse or an object being forced into the anus. He had been decapitated, with bite marks present on the vertebra where the head had been cut away by a sharp instrument. Bite marks were also apparent where the legs had been separated from the torso. The young male's head was affixed to the sternum by a yellow rope that went through his mouth and out the neck and then wrapped around his chest. A time of death was difficult to ascertain, but the body's condition indicated that it had not been immersed in the water for very long. 24 hours before discovery was a rough estimate. The mutilation was so involved it could have taken anywhere from 3 to 6 hours to complete. The killer had, at the very least, a basic medical background. The dissection, particularly of the hands and thigh bones, had been done by someone with a definite knowledge of anatomy and surgical skill. Extracting prints from the severed fingers, the major crime squad were able to identify the victim. 25-year-old Neil Muir lived a transient life. He spent his childhood in rural South Australia before moving to Adelaide in his teens. Known as a country boy and a bit of a loner, the friends he did make introduced him to drugs. By August 1978, Neil was unemployed and lived alone in a boarding house in Adelaide. Neil was trying hard to beat his heroin addiction and was enrolled in the methadone program at Hillcrest Hospital. Neil attended his scheduled appointments on the weekend of August 25th and 26th. At his last appointment, Neil was seen leaving the clinic and getting into a car with an unknown male driver. He was wearing a bone-colored bulky knit cardigan with black stripes, light-colored corduroy jeans, an ebony bangle, a sleeper earring in one ear, and a drop-style earring in the other. He was also carrying a flick knife. 2 days later, his mutilated remains were found floating in the waters off Mutton Cove. Neil Muir's murder bore a disturbing similarity to the Allen Barnes case. Both young men had sustained extensive anal injuries prior to their deaths. It was unclear if Neil had been drugged like Allen, as his stomach was missing, so its contents could not be tested. However, several recent injection sites were found on skin believed to have come from his right arm. Neil also had a wound on his scalp. Not a fatal blow, but enough to render him incapacitated. However, there were also numerous differences between the two murders. Most notably, the condition in which the bodies were found. Given Neil's heroin addiction, detectives theorized that his death was unrelated to Alan Barnes. The gruesome manner in which Neil was treated seemed to be a warning. One drug scene contact for the Advertiser newspaper said that Neil was, quote, a small-time nobody, someone who did not matter. Perhaps that is why he was selected for this type of killing, to show the druggies that no one gets away without paying. This theory was reinforced by the fact that Neil's fingers and tattooed skin were intentionally stored with his body, as though the killer wanted his identity known. Associates of Neil speculated that he had to have either been dealing drugs himself or turning to sex work to cover the costs of his addiction. Divers scoured the Port Adelaide River to find Neil's internal organs, but were unsuccessful. Police speculated that, like Alan Barnes, Neil had been killed elsewhere and driven to water. A policeman present at Neil's autopsy told the Advertiser that wherever he was killed and cut up must have been like a slaughterhouse by the time it was over. Detective Lee Haddon was placed in charge of the Neil Muir murder investigation. Haddon turned to criminal profiling to understand the type of person capable of committing such a sickening act. A police psychologist concluded that the offender was either mentally ill or an extremely sadistic psychopath. They might not openly display aggression, but instead portray themselves as polite, gentle, and neat, while secretly harboring strong and out-of-control sexual urges. 3 days after Neil Muir's body was found, a doctor named Peter Millhouse checked himself into a rehabilitation clinic. When speaking with the admitting nurse, Millhouse revealed that he was an alcoholic and had been on a downward spiral since the beginning of the week when he had gone on a bender. He also cited the fact that he was gay, had increasing debt, and was currently being investigated for writing illegal prescriptions as adding to his depression and drinking problem. 2 days later, while Dr. Peter Millhouse was recuperating, he was paid a visit by Detective Lee Haddon. Haddon had received anonymous tip-offs about the 45-year-old GP, described as a nonviolent, quiet man who kept to himself. Peter Millhouse spent his weekends in hotels in central Adelaide, hoping to hook up for a night of casual sex. Sources revealed that Millhouse was often seen in pubs and clubs with Neil Muir. Witness accounts indicated the pair had known each other for 4 years. It was uncertain whether they were just friends or if Neil was getting drugs or money from the doctor in return for sexual favors. Detectives suspected this could be a possibility, as Peter Millhouse had previously been questioned by the drug squad for writing false prescriptions in return for sex. When confronted by police, Millhouse denied knowing Neil and produced a pre-written letter he had signed. It stated that he would not answer any questions unless in the company of his lawyer. According to the book Young Blood by Detective Bob O'Brien, sources confirmed that Neil Muir and Dr. Peter Millhouse would often drink together at the Hope Inn Sports and Social Club in Ridleyton, north of Adelaide. Detective Lee Haddon paid both establishments a visit. Neil's associates at the social club said that they had last seen the pair drinking there on Sunday, August 26th, the day Neil was thought to have disappeared. They told Detective Haddon to also visit the Mediterranean Hotel on Hindley Street, another city-based hangout spot for the two. Detective Lee Haddon spoke to a bouncer there who knew Neil well. He said that Neil had been at the hotel on the Thursday and Friday nights before he disappeared. On both occasions, he was in the company of Dr. Peter Millhouse. The pair had been drinking schooners at their regular table next to the jukebox. Neil had also visited the bar by himself at lunchtime the day before his body was discovered. He had been wearing brown corduroy jeans with a long-sleeved shirt and drank schooners of beer well into the evening. A waitress complained to the bouncer that Neil had fallen asleep at the table and he was escorted out of the hotel. Neil left without incident, telling the bouncer, "I am going, mate, I am going." Neil staggered down Hindley Street, where Dr. Peter Millhouse would stay when visiting the city. He walked towards Morfitt Street, disappearing into the night. On November 20th, 1979, Detective Lee Haddon and 2 others drove to the small waterfront town of Whyalla, nearly 400 kilometers from Adelaide. Peter Millhouse was out of rehabilitation and was working there as a locum GP. The detectives found him staying at a local hotel and arrested him over the misuse of prescriptions. On the 4-hour drive back to Adelaide, Detective Haddon tried to build rapport and get Milhouse to discuss Neil Muir. He exercised his right to remain silent and was released pending trial. By this stage, detectives had searched Milhouse's North Adelaide residence. He lived by himself and kept the place untidy. Initial testing came back positive for blood on the bathroom floor. However, the area had been cleaned so thoroughly with chemicals that further analysis was not possible. In the kitchen were the same type of garbage bags used to dispose of Neil's body. Outside, a clothesline known for having a distinctive yellow rope had been replaced with metal twine. The plastic bag containing Neil Muir's limbs contained a Band-Aid with tiny fibers stuck to its adhesive glue. Matching fibers were found on a rug in Dr. Peter Milhouse's house, though it could not be proven the fibers on the Band-Aid came from that particular rug. The abundance of circumstantial evidence was enough for detectives to arrest Milhouse for the murder of Neil Muir in January 1979. The next day, he appeared in the Adelaide Magistrates' Court where he was refused bail. The trial began the following year in September. Milhouse gave 3 days of sworn evidence and agreed to be cross-examined by the prosecution in an attempt to clear his name. He told the court that on the day of Neil's murder, he had visited 4 separate hotels. Aside from that, he spent the week indoors. He stated that he only heard of Neil's death when he read about it in the paper 2 days after his body was discovered. Milhouse claimed that even though he had degrees in medicine and surgery, he did not have the necessary knowledge of dissection to have carried out the mutilation of Neil Muir's body. An earlier committal hearing had established that the dissection of Neil Muir's body was likely carried out by someone with surgical expertise. Milhouse countered that he was a mediocre medical student, had done very little surgery as an intern at the Adelaide Children's Hospital, and that he had never performed a post-mortem. The prosecution gave 2 possible motives for the murder of Neil Muir by Peter Milhouse. It might have been a murder committed out of contempt, or it was an accident, and Milhouse mutilated Neil's body to dispose of it. In summing up, the defense argued that the prosecution had not proved its case and that it was dangerous for a jury to accept circumstantial evidence as fact. After 24 days of testimony and 98 witnesses, the jury deliberated for 75 minutes. They found the defendant not guilty. As he walked out of the courtroom, Dr. Peter Milhouse hugged his mother and said, "I am glad to see justice has been done." The arrest and subsequent trial had lasting ramifications for Milhouse. The media reported extensively on aspects of his sex life, including the time he asked Neil to urinate on him in exchange for methadone. Yet Milhouse had been cleared by a court of law, and by the end of 1980, detectives were no closer to making any further arrests. On the morning of Thursday, August 27, 1981, 14-year-old Peter Stogneff was excited. After putting on his school uniform and collecting his bag, he left home. But instead of heading to school as expected, he walked to a nearby shopping mall. When the coast was clear, he returned home, dumping his school bag in the garage before getting changed. He was due to meet his friend, Daniel Stogneff, by the Silver Ball sculpture in Rundle Mall, Adelaide's central hub for shopping. The pair had planned to wag school together, and Daniel said he might even have 2 girls with them. Peter was looking forward to spending the day with them. However, Daniel never followed through with the plan and did not show up at Rundle Mall. Despite this, Peter committed himself to ditching school and continued his day out alone. That same morning, Glenise Richardson was sipping coffee at a cafe in the Tea Tree Plaza, 15 kilometers northeast of Rundle Mall. At around midday, she noticed something very odd. A teen fitting Peter Stogneff's description was walking with a broad-framed, tanned-skinned man wearing a bomber jacket and trendy shoes. He appeared to be around 26 years old. While the scene itself was not out of the ordinary, the vibe between the two suggested to Glenise that something was not quite right. Tea Tree Plaza was near Peter's family home in Hope Valley. Peter did not return home that night. Police appealed for anyone who had seen the blue-eyed teen with the freckled face to come forward. Weeks passed with no sign of Peter, but something strange emerged months later. An off-duty police officer was scanning the shelves of the Tea Tree Gully Library when he picked up a book titled The Man Who Killed Boys, about serial killer John Wayne Gacy. Thumbing through it, he noticed two blood-smeared pages towards the front of the book. Given the library's proximity to Peter Stogneff's house, he turned it into the local police, though a connection was never established between the blood-stained book and the missing teen. Meanwhile, detectives continued to follow up leads that streamed into a tip line but were forced to concede that Peter Stogneff had just vanished without a trace. 19-year-old Mark Langley was having a fantastic time at his friend's birthday party. Earlier that evening, on Saturday, February 27, 1982, Mark dressed in jeans and a blue satin shirt with a blue cardigan over the top. He finished off his look with his beloved silver chain with a crab ingot to represent his star sign, Cancer. The party at Windsor Gardens, a northeastern suburb of Adelaide, had gone well into the night. It offered a reprieve from Mark's weekday work as a plumber, and he was not prepared to call it quits too early. At 1:15 in the morning, Mark and two friends decided to move on and continue their night out in the Adelaide CBD. They piled into a car and made the journey into the warm and dry night. 15 minutes later, they pulled over on War Memorial Drive alongside the River Torrens. As the trio sat enjoying each other's company in the quiet and serene area, a minor argument broke out over cigarettes. Mark left the car in a huff, deciding that he had had enough and would walk home. Mark's friends drove off without him but quickly had a change of heart and decided to go back for him. In order to return to where they left Mark, they had to complete a circuit, continuing down War Memorial Drive, crossing over the River Torrens near the Adelaide Zoo, and driving along Victoria Drive before crossing the River Torrens again on King William Road Bridge. The round trip took them 4 minutes. By the time they got back to their original location, Mark was gone. That night, Robert Windsor was driving along Hackney Street when he spotted a black-haired young man with a strong physique hitchhiking by the road. It was Mark Langley, though Robert did not know the 19-year-old personally. Robert drove past Mark, only to glance back at him in his rearview mirror. He saw another car pull up, and Robert assumed Mark climbed into it. The entire scenario was so brief and unremarkable, Robert did not even take note of what the other vehicle looked like. The following morning, Mark's parents slept in. When they woke and realized their son had not returned home, they became worried. By midday, they had phoned the police, explaining that this behavior was extremely out of character. 9 days passed. Then in Summertown, 16 kilometers east of Adelaide, a farmer was poisoning blackberry bushes encroaching on his Sprigg Road property. Within the invasive leafy bush, the farmer discovered the body of Mark Langley. He was clean and dressed in his jeans and blue woolen cardigan. Missing was his silk shirt and his silver chain. Mark had likely died from major internal injuries caused by being anally assaulted with a bottle. A vertical incision ran down Mark's lower abdomen, from underneath his belly button to the top of his pubic region, a length of 16.5 centimeters. Like a surgical procedure, the area had been shaved and the incision had been crudely but surgically sutured closed with thread and covered with surgical tape. Sections of bowel had been removed via the incision. A pathologist reasoned that the bottle had been inserted deep into the rectum, to the point where it could only be retrieved surgically. It was likely the object contained evidence that could identify the killer, so they removed it completely. The presence of alcohol and prescription medication were found in Mark's bloodstream. The chemicals, methaqualone and diphenhydramine, were the active ingredients in the drug Mandrax, a sedative and hypnotic medication used to treat insomnia. A time of death was difficult to ascertain due to the level of decomposition. It was estimated that Mark had been murdered soon after his abduction. It was now becoming clear that there was a serial killer active in South Australia. Although initially reluctant to draw a concrete connection between the murders of Alan Barnes and Neil Muir over 2 years earlier, the discovery of Mark Langley's body established a disturbing pattern. An unknown assailant was abducting young men off Adelaide's streets, violently sexually assaulting them, before murdering them and, in several cases, mutilating their remains. The victim's body would then be dumped in a secluded spot on the city's outskirts. Smoke wafted into the skies above two wells on June 23, 1982. In the town, located 40 kilometers north of Adelaide, a farmer was conducting a burn-off on his property on Middle Beach Road. Afterwards, as he walked through the burnt landscape, he came across a blackened human skeleton in the ashes. The body had likely been dumped from the dirt road, as it came to rest along the barbed wire fence line boundary of the farmer's property. The male skeleton's spinal cord had been severed with a saw, as had the legs above the knees. The lower legs were missing, although not much more could be ascertained due to the accidental burning of the body. The dissection of the bones drew parallels to the mutilation of Neil Muir. Using skull shape and size as well as dental records, the skeleton was confirmed to be that of missing 14-year-old Peter Stogneff, last seen on the day he wagged school 10 months earlier. Almost a year later, on Sunday, June 5, 1983, Richard Kelvin absent-mindedly played with his pet dog's chrome-studded collar. In his other hand was a telephone receiver. Speaking down the line was his girlfriend, Brigida, who Richard spoke to on the phone every day. Although they had only been dating a month, Richard loved Brigida, and the pair talked about getting engaged when they turned 19 in 4 years' time. It was getting late in the afternoon when Richard told Brigida that he planned to meet up with his friend Carl to kick the footy. He said he would call her the moment he got back. Richard and Carl visited the local park in North Adelaide, 2 kilometers north of the River Torrens. Athletic, fit, and tall for his age at 180 centimeters, Richard enjoyed getting out and being active on the weekends. He took his dog's collar with him and put it around his neck. It stood out against the rest of his outfit, consisting of blue jeans, Adidas sneakers, and a navy blue t-shirt featuring the logo for television station Channel 9. As 6 p.m. drew near, Richard walked his friend Carl to the nearest bus stop on O'Connell Street. As mentioned in the book Young Blood by Detective Bob O'Brien, Carl suggested that they walk to the King William Road bus stop instead, near the Women and Children's Hospital. But Richard dissuaded him. He felt it would be unsafe to cross the darkened parkland to get there. While they waited for the bus, Richard asked Carl what he thought of his dog collar accessory. Carl told him it looked stupid, and in response, Richard took it off and tied it around his wrist instead. Carl boarded the next bus, and Richard set off along the busy street to his family's townhouse, approximately 300 meters away. 50 meters from Richard's home lived a man who worked as a security guard. Suffering from a bout of the flu, he went to bed early that evening, only to be woken up at around 6:15. Someone outside was crying for help. He then heard the sound of car doors banging, followed by a loud exhaust as a car accelerated away. The security guard did not think anything of it at the time and drifted back to sleep. Days later, detectives showed up at his house. They were door-knocking the area in search of 15-year-old Richard Kelvin, who had failed to return home 2 days earlier after visiting the local park with a friend. The security guard told the detectives of the cries for help and the accelerating car he heard that night. Being a car enthusiast, he was able to identify the vehicle's exhaust as sounding like it belonged to a Holden with a faulty muffler. Richard's father's celebrity status ensured the teen's unexplained disappearance drew a large amount of police and media focus. Rob Kelvin was a newsreader for Channel 9. A professional with a strong temperament, Rob continued to present the news each night, despite the overwhelming distress he faced off-camera. He stopped short of reading out any reports regarding his missing son. By the time Richard Kelvin vanished, South Australia's Major Crimes Unit was overwhelmed and their resources were stretched. They were still investigating the murders of Alan Barnes, Neil Muir, Mark Langley, and Peter Stogneff. Other urgent investigations were also underway, including the search for 10-year-old Louise Bell, who was abducted from her home in Hackham West 4 months earlier. In Richard's case, they immediately suspected he had met with foul play. They even collected one of his school books to compare handwriting samples against any ransom letters they might receive from a kidnapper targeting Richard's high-profile father. Trevor Ford hosted a nightly talkback segment on Adelaide radio station 5DN. In the aftermath of Richard Kelvin's disappearance, Trevor was live on air when a call came through from an unidentified male. He said that Richard was being held in a caravan in the Mount Crawford area of the Adelaide Hills before promptly hanging up. Given Mount Crawford's proximity to the locations where Alan Barnes and Mark Langley's bodies were found, detectives thought this a worthwhile lead. An aerial search did locate a few run-down and abandoned caravans amongst the bushland, but all were empty. Soon after, the major crime squad received a telephone tip-off of their own. The mail caller named two men, Mark and Doug, as being responsible for Richard's abduction. He said that they drove a light-colored 1963 E.J. Holden sedan. The vehicle was in good condition, fitted with a tow bar and two mirrors on the front guards. This make and model of car used to be very popular. However, over the years, the numbers on the road had dwindled, making it somewhat of a rarer vehicle. According to the book Youngblood, a full-page image of the car in question, alongside a photo of Richard Kelvin, was published in the Advertiser newspaper. It failed to generate any worthwhile response, leading investigators to believe the entire story was a hoax. 7 weeks passed and police were no closer to finding Richard. Situated 36 kilometers southeast of Adelaide City lies the small town of Kersbrook. In the heart of the sprawling Adelaide Hills region, Kersbrook is home to only a couple of hundred people. On Sunday, July 24, 1983, Kersbrook resident Trevor Holmes and his family took to the bush around their home in search of moss-covered stones to put in their garden. Wandering away from his wife and children, Trevor came across some distinctive pale fragments on the ground. He thought they were kangaroo bones and inched closer to have a look. Suddenly, a person caught his eye. It was a young male with sandy blonde hair. He was lying in the nearby scrub on his left side and in the fetal position. Thinking that the man was injured, Trevor called out to him but was met with silence. Trevor approached and saw the Channel 9 logo on the man's shirt. A dog collar was fastened around his neck. Trevor bent down, cleared the scrub away from the man's face, and realized he had found the body of Richard Kelvin. An autopsy showed a subdural hemorrhage from a head injury that had occurred early on in Richard's abduction. This blow would have been enough to kill him, but the partial resolution of the hemorrhage indicated that he had survived the attack. Bruising down Richard's back and buttocks were estimated to have been inflicted 2 weeks before his death. He also showed signs of anal trauma. Richard's body had been washed prior to being redressed, and his captor had also given him a haircut. Unique fibers were found on Richard's clothing, including his underwear. They came in a variety of colors: blue, turquoise, purple, orange, yellow, black, brown, red, and green. 7 foreign human hairs were also found on the inside legs of Richard's jeans. Richard had been kept alive for up to 5 weeks before succumbing to blood loss. Traces of various sedatives including Valium, Amital, and Rohypnol were found in his system, as was Mandrax, the drug also used to weaken Mark Langley. Richard had also been given alcohol laced with chloral hydrate, like Alan Barnes. Kersbrook was accessible via South Para Road, which also led to the South Para Reservoir, where Alan Barnes was found. The strength required to throw Alan Barnes's body over a meter-high bridge railing, the extensive mutilation of Neil Muir's body, the surgical procedure performed on Mark Langley, and the difficulties in keeping Richard Kelvin captive for 5 weeks all pointed to more than one individual being responsible for the crimes. Detectives were certain that the young men were imprisoned and killed somewhere where large volumes of blood could be cleaned up easily, such as a factory, a butcher's shop, or somewhere with commercial cleaning facilities. Richard Kelvin was the killer's 5th known victim, and with the discovery of his body, a wave of hysteria swept over Adelaide. Vigilantes patrolled the River Torrens, keeping their eyes out for suspicious activity and to protect passers-by. The media did little to quell the overwhelming fear, with criminologist Dr. Alan Perry warning that the publicity surrounding the case would be giving the perpetrator immense satisfaction. In an attempt to reassure the public, a detective appeared on current affairs program 60 Minutes. He vowed that the police were taking every action to break up the happy family of murderers. The remark led to the creation of the title the homicides would come to be known as the Family Murders. Mandrax, also known as Quaaludes, was a sedative and hypnotic medication commonly used to treat insomnia in the 1970s. Taking the drug, particularly in doses above the recommended therapeutic range, caused the user to feel a rush of euphoria, a relaxed mood, and heightened sexual arousal. As such, the drug was known colloquially as Randy Mandy. Because of the potential for Mandrax to become abused and dependency to occur, in 1978, the drug came under stricter laws governing its prescription. As a result, the medication was prescribed much less frequently. Those that took Mandrax were not allowed to continue on it for more than 2 months without approval from the Central Board of Health. As Mark Langley and Richard Kelvin had been tranquilized with Mandrax, detectives Trevor Kipling and Bob O'Brien visited the Adelaide offices of the State Health Commission. The 8-story building held copies of all prescriptions for restricted drugs in South Australia. Working on a long shot, they began leafing through the thousands of scripts for Mandrax that were housed in large drawers. About an hour later, Trevor Kipling motioned to his partner to stop looking. He had a prescription in his hand. While the name did not ring any bells for Bob O'Brien, Trevor remembered being told of an incident that had occurred 10 months prior, on Saturday, September 11, 1982. 3 months after Peter Stogneff's charred remains were found, a 36-year-old man was filling up an esky with ice at an iceworks on Lower Portrush Road, near to where it crossed the River Torrens. A 16-year-old boy known as George suddenly caught his attention. The teen was hitchhiking along the road and approaching where the man was waiting near his car. He offered George a ride, and the pair then got into the man's bronze Ford Falcon. As mentioned in the book Young Blood, as the pair drove along, the man told George about a party. He said there would be alcohol and girls there, adding that they would have a great time. The man then drove George to a house. There was no wild party as he had promised, just a few women drinking. George was offered a drink, which made him feel groggy. He was led into a bedroom by one of the women who took advantage of his vulnerable state, while the man who picked him up watched. George then passed out. 2 days later, George entered the Holden Hill police station in northeast Adelaide. His memory was hazy, though he was clearly distressed. George recalled hitchhiking home on Saturday night, the bronze Ford Falcon, the male driver, and the gathering at the house. 24 hours after arriving at the house, George was returned home in a taxi. A checkup by a doctor showed that he had suffered anal trauma. Officer Sam Bass from the Holden Hill Crime Investigation Bureau spoke to the taxi driver who had driven George home on the night of the 11th. He then visited the pickup address in the metropolitan suburb of Alberton, a 20-minute drive from the city. The occupants of the slightly shabby but ordinary low-set home were questioned. 3 people lived at the address, a gay man and 2 transgender women, one of whom, for this episode, we will refer to as Miss P. She was later arrested for the rape of George. However, the case against her was ultimately dismissed in the Port Adelaide court when no evidence was brought forward. However, Miss P and her housemates did name the man who had brought George to their doorstep, Bevan Spencer von Einem. Officer Bass drove to von Einem's workplace, Pipeline Supplies of Australia, to discuss the allegations leveled against him. He did not want to be spoken to at work, but agreed to be interviewed at the Holden Hill police station. Von Einem remembered the night in question, though maintained that George was more than willing to go to the party. He alleged that after they arrived at approximately 1 a.m., they listened to music. George drank beer and brandy while chatting to the house guests. Von Einem denied spiking any of George's drinks and stated that George willingly slept with Miss P. He also denied being in the bedroom with them at any time. Von Einem said that after the sexual encounter, Miss P came out of her bedroom and fell asleep on the lounge, while George slept in her bed. Von Einem went into the room and lay on top of the covers next to George. The pair slept late into the next afternoon. When they awoke, von Einem claimed George had been too tired to shower from the night spent drinking. Von Einem then undressed the teen and washed him before sending him home in a taxi, handing the driver $15 and George's home address written on a scrap of paper. Detective Trevor Kipling was later told of this incident by a Holden Hill police officer. Even though George ultimately declined to press charges, Kipling had remembered the unusual name of his alleged assailant. Kipling looked down at the name on the Mandrak's prescription in his hands. Bevan Spencer von Einem. In 2005, von Einem was prescribed Cialis, a drug for erectile dysfunction. Under its influence, he raped a fellow prisoner so violently that the victim needed extensive surgery. The rape charge was later dropped due to insufficient evidence. Cialis was subsequently banned from prisons. In 2008, a cold case review of the family murders obtained DNA samples from major suspects. No new evidence was found and no further charges were laid. Bevan Spencer von Einem is now in his 70s, suffering from diabetes, and housed in the geriatric section of a high-security prison. A change in legislation in 2007 means he will never be released. He will die in prison. A reward of up to $1 million remains on offer for information leading to the conviction of anyone else involved in the family murders. Detective Superintendent Grant Moyle said, "It is never too late for them to come forward. No one involved should ever sleep easy." Alan Barnes's brother Charlie said, "I would like them to shed the guilt and remorse they must be carrying. I know the police are like bulldogs and will not let go of this. They may well tap you on the shoulder one day." Docket Unsealed. One file, one truth.